Dear friends, I'm very honored to have been invited to deliver this lecture in a year when Canada celebrates 150 years of Confederation and Ukrainian Canadians 125 years of recorded settlement. Not having been in Canada for 25 years, my somewhat impulsive acceptance of the offer to speak was driven by the prospect of reconnecting with a community and friends who, as so often happens, you appreciate more than ever after a period of absence. But then came the problematic part, the topic of the lecture. So recently I've been reflecting and writing about the implications of the global economic new normal, in quotation marks, for the region where I have been working for more than 12 years, that's Central Asia and Afghanistan, and in particular their mountain societies. So tonight I would like to offer some thoughts on the topic in a context that honors the name and purpose of this lecture, the context of Ukraine. But first, I thought we should take a cold, hard look at what has happened in the world, what has brought us to this seemingly chaotic and unpredictable present. It is clear that what we have is not merely a technical downturn of some sort of new normal cycle of long-term recession. It is more serious, and it also likely represents the new normal for decades ahead. Realities that we have taken for granted are no longer certain. But the new normal, I think we can all agree, is not normal. It is the new not normal. The normal that is emerging by any measure of social aspirations is flawed and not sustainable. The global order has become a disorder, and because it is not normal, it is difficult for us to make sense of the world. External shocks, such as climate change, are part of this. The term disorder also implies that it is being contested, and we can see that everywhere. But the puzzling question is what may emerge as an alternative, and what capacities do societies have to bring about this change. In the course of their post-Soviet struggles to achieve a fair and just society, Ukrainians have faced challenges and have provided many important examples and lessons for those who are ready to engage in contesting power. So in my talk, I will try to track empirical evidence on the durable impact of Maidan as a revolution of dignity and will ignore the current headlines. A friend of mine from Kyrgyzstan, hearing about this lecture, forewarned me, "You better give good news or else don't bother to show up." Well, I have shown up, and I hope that my talk will offer more hope than despair. So where do we begin? For those who uphold liberal democratic values, pluralism, the idea of a socially oriented economy, 2016 was an annus horribilis. It's not just about the election of Donald Trump or Brexit, but also the tragedy of Syria, abandoned to its suffering, the extensive support in Hungary and Poland and elsewhere for an oxymoron called a liberal democracy, and in Turkey that was a model for the Middle East, secular, vibrant, high growth rates, unique status of women, where Erdogan's counter-revolution, among other consequences, means the country is literally losing its brains. With one stroke of the pen, almost 650 professors were fired, along with 28,000 school teachers. In Philippines, a president was voted into office who not only deployed death squads that have killed some 9,000 people in 7 months, but who brags about pulling the trigger. And of course, Putin, committed to undermining liberal democratic values to make the world safe for autocracy, giving loans to Marine Le Pen to fund an electoral campaign, having his United Party Russia sign a cooperation agreement with Austria's nauseous Freedom Party with its anti-Semitic past, donating to think tanks, etc. The campaign to undermine European institutions has been particularly damaging for Ukraine, as the Dutch referendum showed. In Brazil in 2016, it had its own Maidan that saw 3.5 million people demonstrating in 326 cities against President Rousseff, who was mired in corruption. Placards making reference to Maidan were on display everywhere during the protests. Russia weighed in to defend Rousseff, warning that, quote, the Brazilian Maidan scenario will have tremendous implications, not just for Latin America, but for the world as a whole, paying, I think, an enormous compliment to what Ukrainians did in Maidan. Needless to say, Rousseff was impeached. But overall, faced with the current litany of reversals, many liberal Democrats have lost their nerve, and some are rushing to write liberal democracy's obituary. To recast the point made by The Economist magazine, the bitter harvest of 2016 has not suddenly destroyed the claim of liberal democracy and a socially oriented economy as the best way we know how to confer dignity, prosperity, and equity. Rather than ducking the struggle of ideas, one should engage. But unfortunately, many of those who share this vision of society have become complacent. As a Kyrgyz colleague pointed out, liberals and social democrats have no teeth. And now a wave of populism has moved to the forefront. Its popular base is composed of large sections of ordinary people whose quality of life has not improved, who see wealth as a cover for privilege, whose jobs are being destroyed by technology, who experience stagnating social mobility and economic exclusion, and believe that other cultures pose threats. Much is said about the marginalized working class and Rust Belt communities. They ought to have been the natural constituency of social democrats. This did not happen in part because of the decline of trade unions that served as transmission belts of humane organizing ideas, but also because critical sectors of society, the thinking crowd, that comes from all walks of life, were passive, focused on their individual careers and narrow social networks, forgetting the common interest, the common good. Instead, the cry of frustration has been garnered by right-wing populist charlatans. It took a Trump victory to shake large sectors of American society to the realization that values and principles are not statum naturae, a state of nature, but constantly have to be reaffirmed. The kind of populism we are seeing today is not a new idea. It is incoherent, it has been tried, and it failed miserably. Perhaps its worst expression was in Argentina, where nationalism and protectionism under Perón devastated this wonderful country that in 1950 had a GDP higher than Germany and Norway, and today languishes in the doldrums. The locus of new populism is the United States and Europe, whose elites drove an economic model that ignored the basic principles of human solidarity in their countries and ended up framing an international disorder. Populists offer a cacophony of ersatz messages that are a dead end, but their clarion call for change is one that should be embraced. The task is to understand and harness that agitated yearning to craft social and economic policies that are inclusive. It was very sobering and sad to hear the words of Karl Heinrich Helden, the chairman of the Nobel Peace Prize Foundation, who at the opening address of the 2016 prize ceremony said, Leading politicians, both in Europe and the United States, are winning votes by denying knowledge and scientific truths. Populism is widespread and gaining major political success. The very grim truth is that we can no longer take it for granted that people believe in science, facts, and knowledge. We simply have to win the battle against demagoguery and obscurantist sloganeering. Universities have to rise to the challenge. The issues we are facing are analytically complex and need to be framed within a reinvigorated framework of values that places solidarity as a centerpiece. So let me turn to the economy, and I will organize the effort to make sense of trends and alternative pathways of development around the question of inequality, an issue that Canada's Minister of Global Affairs brought to public attention in her book, The Plutocrats. The facts are quite startling. Almost half of the world's wealth is now owned by just 1% of the population. The wealth of 1% of the richest people of the world amounts to 110 trillion. That is 65 times the total wealth of the bottom half of the world's population. The bottom half of the world's population owns the same as 8 of the richest people in the world. In the United States, the wealthiest 1% captured 96% of the post-financial crisis growth since 2009, while the bottom percent became poorer. Russia is the world's most unequal country, with a staggering 75% of the nation's wealth controlled by less than 1% of the population. Income and inequality and wealth inequality is usually the outcome of a complex economic and social process that is related to the size of the gross national product, and I want to spend a little bit of time on that. The size of GNP and the way it is shared between members of society. To be simplistic, one can think of 2 groups of people, the rich and everyone else. For sustainable and inclusive growth, it is important to consider not only who gets what, but how wealth is accumulated. And you can think of 2 scenarios, to be simplistic about it. In one scenario, total GNP grows slowly and incomes of the rich grow faster than income of others, and that slow growth is at the expense of others. This happens when the source of wealth of the rich is not from entrepreneurial activities, but from so-called rents, benefits from a natural monopoly such as oil, ownership of natural resources such as oil, I'm repeating myself, capturing state power for accumulation of private wealth, creating artificial monopoly, corruption, corporate raiding, theft of public funds. The former Soviet countries provide multiple examples of these worst practices. In scenario 2, growth occurs because of technological developments and globalization, the shift of a significant part of industrial production from Western countries to developing countries. In this case, growth is driven by entrepreneurs who get a larger share of the pie, as in China, but unlike wealth generated by rent-seeking, there are no net losers in absolute terms. And in general, the economic situation remains healthy. It is worthwhile understanding what kind of unit of society we are talking about. Because if we consider global society as a whole, then the shift has been quite inclusive and inequality reducing, and it enormously benefited the very poor in China and other developing countries. Total GNP grew, and so did the income other members of all members of society. Because incomes grow in this scenario, so does domestic consumption. In China, the middle class now is around 500 million people, and another 70 million rural people will be lifted out of poverty in the next couple of years. An economy whose growth was driven by investment and exports is now largely driven by domestic consumption. Net exports represent less than 0.2% of GDP growth. The political ramifications of this change in the economy is something, of course, that the Communist Party is struggling to contain. If you look at data from 1988 to 2008, over 500 million people were brought out of poverty, and global inequality declined sharply. This is truly a mammoth achievement. Looking at rich and middle-income countries, one sees that mature economies also saw income gains of some 40% or higher, except in the former Soviet Union because of political and economic disruption, and in Japan because of demographic factors. So let's take a closer look at the widespread belief by right-wing and left-wing populists that the slow income growth of low and middle-class workers in rich countries is the result of globalization. It is true that inequality rose in the United States. In that country, the only boost middle and low-income families received was during the tech boom of the 1990s. Otherwise, it's been a quagmire. For the rich as Americans, on the other hand, wages have nothing but climbed. While inequality rose in the United States, there are many countries where it did not. In Ireland, for example, the real gains were 90%. The variability of income growth and inequality, despite the same experiences of globalization and technology, suggests that there are other factors that are the culprits. And the main culprit is the financialization of the economy, whose consequences Rana Forahar powerfully presented in her book, Makers and Takers. In a nutshell, the rules that govern the US free market system have been warped. Over the past few decades, finance has turned away from its traditional role, and only a fraction of all money washing around financial markets these days actually makes it to Main Street business. Only 50% of capital coming from financial institutions is used to fund investments and business, whereas this would have been the majority of activity of banks earlier in the 20th century. The financial sector, while currently taking around 25% of corporate profits, creates less than 4% of all jobs. Lending to small business has fallen sharply. For all the talk of Silicon Valley, the number of new startups has shrunk. From 1978 to 2012, it declined by 44%. One of the more staggering figures is that if you look at S&P 500 firms, they spend $1 trillion a year on buybacks and dividends, equal to 95% of their net earnings, rather than investing money into research, product development, or anything that could contribute to long-term company and economic growth. And this represents a massive failure of public policy, of proper regulation. In the United States, and not only there, a new industrial policy is needed, one that focuses on the most productive patterns of investment, advancing sectors that promise to be strong international competitors, while helping to develop industrial infrastructure, highways, ports, sewers, regional growth, and especially government investment in developing a skilled workforce to support this endeavor. That this kind of agenda was published in the Harvard Business Review gives room for optimism. Rather than complain about competition from Asia, do something about it. UK's industrial strategy is hampered by a shortage of engineers. UK has a population of 65 million and graduates 25,000 engineers annually. Singapore has 7% of UK's population and graduates the same number of engineers, according to a BBC report. Rethinking social policy is also critical to address the plight of the middle class. A Brookings Institute study showed that the soaring costs of childcare and education were the biggest drivers of the stagnation of middle-class incomes. So to end this topic with the start of a discussion of Ukraine, I think it should be pointed out that Ukraine is a highly egalitarian society. The Gini coefficient, a statistical measure used in analyzing income inequality, and by this measure, Ukraine is more egalitarian than Sweden by a wisp, and far more egalitarian than the countries in its neighborhood. Ukraine is what is called a premature welfare economy. That means it can't afford it. But it is an expression of social consensus, and while welfare reform is needed, in the first instance, attention should be paid on stimulating growth. And another fact to set the stage when considering Russia's global ambitions, let it be remembered that Russia's GDP is smaller than Canada's and just a fraction bigger than Mexico's, and both countries obviously don't have the kind of global ambitions and armaments plan. Its GDP per capita is between Mexico and Turkey's. So framing comments on Ukraine was the most difficult part of preparing this talk. I moved to Ukraine before independence and was fortunate enough to participate in the establishment of institutions, and everything was so fragile at that time. During the putsch, I remember getting an urgent call in the middle of the night from the Secretariat of Parliament to go outside and see if tanks were rolling on the street where I lived, Lenin, now Khmelnytsky. I pointed out that the street was cobblestone and tanks are really noisy, and I really don't need to poke my head out to hear them, but I did and reported that all was quiet on the Western Access Road. At the start of independence, Ukraine ended up with the fourth largest army in the world, almost 1 million troops, but it had no Ministry of Defense. It opened up offices with a staff of 7. I have very, very many fond memories of the road Ukraine traveled, the hopes and disappointments. While I am very moved by the Ukrainian national anthem, it speaks volumes about Ukrainians' disposition. You know very well the anthem begins with, "Ukraine is not dead yet, nor freedom nor glory, and that our enemies will perish like the dew from the sun." And only Ukrainians would use the word enemies in its diminutive form, vorozhenki, that conveys a sense of endearment. Opponents of progress of the people of Ukraine will not vanish like the dew when the sun comes up. It actually takes a bit of effort. And in the rest of this talk, I will suggest where that effort could be made. Ukrainian society is remarkably resilient, a people decimated by famine, purges, enormous losses during the Second World War, whose cultural identity was assaulted by policies of Russification. In 1990, launched one of the most unprecedented social mobilizations in modern history, the movement for independence. It engaged millions, and it succeeded because it incorporated inclusive democratic discourse. Then the Orange Revolution and Maidan, courageous mass mobilization, affirming the best of human values. An army of volunteers that contained grandiose plans for imperial expansion. You will recall the Novorossiya project. Ukrainian society has generally been on the right side of history. Its history is replete with rebellion against an existing order and failures to create a new one. But things have changed because of Maidan, an expression of accumulated aspirations that resulted in a tectonic shift in Ukrainian society. The country is faced with a surcharged agenda of institutional and economic reform at a time of occupation. It is also in a very difficult neighborhood, and the global disorders have created a multi-political chessboard that, as one expert noted, every international relations textbook and playbook can be thrown away. Working in Ukraine, I can't recount the number of times consultants told me that what the country needs is good institutions. Well, that's not a particularly perspicacious observation, and it begs the question, and so where do good institutions come from? And thinking about this reminded me of something I read in my youth. I quote, my inquiry led me to the conclusion that neither legal relations nor political forms can be comprehended on the basis of the so-called general development of the human mind. So good institutions don't come because of a development in your head. To continue, they originate in the material conditions of life, the totality of which is embraced by the term civil society. Good institutions emerge from civil society. The anatomy of this civil society, however, has to be sought in political economy. And political economy here is understood as Rechtsstaat, a state of rights. If you have a state of right that allows civil society to flourish over a longer period of time, you're going to get good institutions. And so from this, I'm actually going to turn to a discussion of Ukraine's IT industry, because this is a very interesting case study of how rights were exercised. And this is a story that ties together many strands. A couple of days ago, I was sitting in Bishkek watching a BBC story on how civil society organizations in Ukraine are using drones in the fight against corruption. That I watched this in my city on the city network, a city that some visitors term as at the end of the world, and that NGOs in Ukraine are using drones to spot undeclared net value assets, says volumes about innovation. That IT industry is robust in Ukraine carries lessons for political economy. Ukraine's IT industry is driven by youth, the generation of Maidan. The average age of people active in this sector is 27 years old. It is sustainable because it began as entirely export-driven and globally competitive and has moved to meet internal market needs. By all reasonable forecasts, its exports are over $5 billion. That's Ukraine's third largest exports. And this obviously helps the balance of payments. Its companies employ 200,000 professionals whose economic contribution to other IT-related sectors is some 400,000 jobs. And these are conservative estimates of employment because they deal only with those that are officially registered. The real employment is much larger. In 2014, the formal IT sector paid 5% of the total tax revenues of Ukraine, while employing less than 1% of the labor force. And its contribution is expected to grow by 90% in the next couple of years. I remember, and I'm sure many of you remember, when Lviv's economy in 1990 was in the doldrums and dominated by that gigantic enterprise called Electron that produced televisions that had a tendency to explode. Lviv reinvented itself as a vibrant European city where almost 100 out of 1,000 employed is now working in the IT sector. Tourism and service industries are flourishing. The IT sector is also the most dynamic driver of Ukraine's education reform, and the first endowed chair at a state university is by an IT entrepreneur who would like to receive higher quality professionals. Now I'm really going to beg your patience, and I'm going to talk about Ukrainian agriculture with a side glance at bean production in Talas Oblast in Kyrgyzstan, and I assure you there is a connection. There was a surreal moment under Brezhnev when the USSR imported wheat from Canada, with Ukrainian-Canadian farmers providing a Bukovinian strain of wheat to their long-lost relatives in Ukraine that had once been the breadbasket of Europe. Things have changed significantly. Today, Ukraine is a major player in global food security. 800 million people around the world are suffering from chronic hunger. Global food production has to be increased by 60% by 2020, and that's not very far. That's not very long away. Ukraine has 1/3 of the world's black earth soil and one of the least vulnerable regions to climate change. Agriculture today occupies first place in Ukraine's exports. It's around $17 billion. Formal employment in agriculture is 15% of the total of people employed. And by agriculture, I don't mean working in the fields. It's obviously agribusiness and processing and this sort of thing. Ukrainian agriculture could have been in the doldrums because faced with a blockade of Russia, the agricultural sector could have come to a halt or been very seriously damaged. But instead, Ukraine went global and succeeded with exports to 190 countries and is growing. In Kyrgyzstan, bean production in Talas Oblast is globally competitive and is a bright spot on the country's economic landscape. Some really interesting innovations are taking place as farmer communities, without any consultant, on their own develop a futures market that helps price stabilization and provides a good measure of income security to producers. So what does all of this have to do with political economy? The IT sector grew in Ukraine because the government couldn't figure out how to regulate it. The same was true in India. Agriculture grew in Ukraine and in Talas because governments had no agricultural policy to speak of. These successes emerged because of the energies unleashed in society. In public policy, one of the first questions you ask yourself is, should there be government intervention? There are many spheres where government intervention is essential, but the legacy of the Soviet system is that you try to regulate everything, which is usually done very badly, with corruption schemes in mind. Public policy is about what governments do and don't do. In the post-Soviet sphere, not doing things is in many cases more important than doing things. Ukraine's civil society robust fight against corruption is critically important for economic growth, and so I hope the drones keep flying. What about the Donbass? The occupation has devastated the economy. Before the war, it represented 15% of gross regional product. Today, it's less than 5%. Donbass contributes 21 billion hryvnia to the budget and receives 440 billion in the form of subsidies for industries and welfare payments. Russia is not prepared to foot the bill to keep Donbass economy afloat. It simply doesn't have the funds because of the collapse of oil prices. And it is faced with claims from its own population because the real income of Russian citizens has fallen by some 15% in the last year or so. The occupied territories will be recovered, but economic reconstruction, or more to the point, reinventing the economy, is going to be a formidable task. But this is a region that has huge human potential, whose energies can be tapped in this endeavor. Of course, I am an advocate of government having policies. Ukraine has suffered colossal economic shocks as a result of the war. Between 2014 and 15, GDP contracted by 21%, and that is a staggering number. But because of the de-escalation of the war and some reforms, the economy is finally growing, 2% in this year and probably 3% in next. Smart government action is required in 3 areas to bolster growth and reduce poverty. And a priority measure is to stimulate the growth of small and medium business and medium and small towns. The data on small and medium business, SMEs, is absolutely dismal. World Bank statistics for 2013 show that in Canada, 65.5%, almost 66% of all private sector employees work in SMEs. In Poland, it's 63, in Italy, it's 78. In Ukraine, it's 31. The number of such enterprises per 1,000 people in Ukraine is 4.8%. In the United States, it's 74%. When we look at the contribution of SMEs to GDP, we find that the average in Europe is about 67%. But in Ukraine, it's among the lowest in the world, 10%. So this sector that elsewhere provides the greatest amount of employment, makes the largest contribution to GDP, and is the most dynamic and adaptive, is largely missing in Ukraine. There are many obstacles to SME growth in Ukraine: labyrinthian registrations and permissions processes, high compliance costs, massive regulatory burden, not to mention corruption. But the availability of a workforce that can easily be retrained and a very decent infrastructure are factors that spell for a promising future, and this is going to be the engine of economic growth in Ukraine in the future, and the situation is improving. One of the things I looked at is the emerging dynamic textile and apparel sector that is driven by 2,000 SMEs. And Ukraine has a great advantage over here because of the availability of high-quality raw materials, a skilled workforce, and highly talented fashion designers. And finally, prompted by the European Union, the government has adopted an SME policy that was developed in a very unusual practice for the Ukrainian government, and that is through rigorous and vigorous public consultation with stakeholders. SME growth is critical also to another issue that that very often is forgotten, and that is the future of small and medium towns. The significance of small and medium towns in Ukraine is all too often overlooked. Although Ukraine has a high urbanization rate, it's about over 70%, more than 50% of the population live in small towns, urban settlements, urban-type settlements or villages. And a village in Ukraine can be 20,000 people. And 20% live in medium towns. Only 1 in 3 Ukrainian lives in a big city. In the EU, 2 out of 5 residents live in small towns, where they find employment and dynamic enterprises. Germany's Mittelstand, the median-sized enterprises, are a cornerstone of their economy, and they're strewn across small towns. A survey of small businesses in Latin America showed that 70% of all manufacturing originates in small towns. The neglect of small towns is, of course, very much a legacy of Soviet industrialization. So let me turn to education. This is another area where reform is highly overdue. In 2012, Ukraine had some 2.3 million students in tertiary education in some 800 institutions. Gross enrollment Gross enrollment in higher education in Ukraine is one of the highest in the world. 80% of the relevant age group go to university, whereas in Canada the figure is 60%. The country spends 6.5% of GDP on education. That is higher than what highly developed capitalist countries spend, and that's about 4.7% of GDP. And 1/3 of all expenditure on education goes on higher education. But the figures on higher education really don't reflect the reality, because through various corruption schemes, private citizens, and maybe not even just corruption schemes, there's no official tuition, private citizens pay 50%, the equivalent of the budgetary allocation. So the amount of money washing in the educational system is actually much higher, and in some institutions it's much higher than 50%. But higher education, that should be a driver of economic growth, in Ukraine, this function is very flawed. And reform of education is probably one of the most important items of the agenda. Higher education is strangled by regulations, antediluvian curriculum and pedagogical practice. It is riddled with corruption. And the system simply squanders human capital. In 2014, in a country not noted for its rule of law, it graduated 30,000 lawyers. If you take all of the natural sciences together, it graduated less than 9,000. In Kyrgyzstan, the figure, this is a post-Soviet syndrome. In Kyrgyzstan, the figure goes like this. In the last 4 years, a country of 5 million people, not noted for its rule of law, graduated 12,000 lawyers. Actually, 12,254 to be precise. And it graduated 9 geologists and a total of 118 people active in any way related to the extractive industry. And what is the government's #1 priority? Extractive industry. For some reason, a government priority bears no relationship to the educational system. And one of the reasons is because the job description of the head of someone in the educational system is not to meet the needs of the society, but to organize corruption scheme. You have to change the job description. And interestingly, by the way, one of the reasons why IT industry progressed is probably the least corrupt of all sectors of higher education or mathematics departments. That the social sciences remain particularly weak means that there is a paucity of intellect to address pressing social and economic issues facing the country. Sorely lacking on the higher educational landscape in Ukraine are also universities of applied sciences that have a long tradition in continental Europe, something along the lines of community colleges. The Fachhochschule in Germany and their equivalents focus on the arts and sciences in their practical implication. They do research along these lines. They're absolutely critical to the economy, and this sector is almost entirely missing in Ukraine. I am a very big advocate of liberal arts education because, among other things, as studies have shown, it prepares people to better cope with shifting labor markets because they are more adaptable. At the institution where I work, we have very demanding technical majors, a world-class IT curriculum, but all students must take a core curriculum that exposes them to ways of thinking, the aesthetic experience of literature and the arts, history as a mode of understanding of human affairs, the concepts and analytical techniques of modern social science, and the mathematical and experimental methods of the natural sciences. And ethics is taught across the curriculum. There are ethical issues involved in just about everything, probably not in linear algebra. Linking consideration of ethics, ethical issues, explicitly to learning outcomes for every module was an approach actually first developed in architectural schools. The outrageous scams and unbridled greed that came to light during the financial crisis, the cheating on emissions control, are stark examples of what happens when you lose a moral compass. And this is one of the reasons why good business schools have now revised their curriculum and introduced an ethical component, a component on ethics. Universities are the place where critical thinking should be fostered, where overarching societal values are communicated. This is where elites are shaped. A persistent cry in Ukraine is that the country has a somewhat dreadful political class. But where do decent political classes come from? What are the social institutions that shape political classes? Universities where corruption is seemingly pervasive, where grades can be negotiated and diplomas bought, create a moral climate where values are debased at exactly the time in the period of life of young people when moral reasoning should be honed. 10 March is the 155th anniversary of Shevchenko's death. In the mid-60s, this remarkable person, Alla Horska, did a stained glass window that was installed in the vestibule of Shevchenko University in Kiev. It depicted a militant Shevchenko with a fist raised in defiance, and on the other hand, in the other hand, he was holding a book, and described on this vitrage were lines of his poetry. «Возвеличу малих отих рабов німих, я насторожі, коли їх поставлю слово». The gist of it in English goes like this: I will give voice to the common people who are not heard. In their defense, I will place the word. In this context, word is also to be understood as logos, as reason. Shevchenko's words are a powerful statement of the social responsibility of intellectuals and universities. The stained glass window was destroyed, and in 1970, Alla Horska was murdered. The issues facing Ukrainian society are analytically complex. There are no easy solutions. The application of knowledge to public problems is the task of policy analysis. In the post-Soviet transition, tasks such as macroeconomic stabilization, price liberalization, privatization were accomplished, and they were not particularly complicated to do. They were rather simple things. But beyond that, it gets much more difficult, and sustained application of the mind to policy problems, policy analysis, and effort is required. Anyone can collect rent, anyone can steal, but reforming social welfare, health, or education, economic reforms that advance quality growth, these are tough challenges. That the external context has changed and society has now many actors adds to the complexity. The failure of governments to adopt good policy is generally attributed to the lack of political will. True enough. But even if there was political will, they couldn't do it because government agencies have very little capacity in this field. In the machinery of government, of mature democracies, just look at any telephone directory of government departments. You'll see that present in every ministry are many departments and units staffed by a slew of professionals dealing with policy analysis and evaluation. For all intents and purposes, this is missing in Ukraine. Some unit exists, but they are tiny. The policy unit at the Ministry of Education numbers around 12 people, and that's for a population of 40 million. And in the province of Alberta, probably about 200 people are involved in this exercise in the Department of Education. The focus of the machinery of government is on ruchne upravlение, hand management, operational issues. I once helped do a study that looked at Ukraine's Ministry of Finance. Now, this is a critical ministry. If any place should have analysis, it would be the Ministry of Finance. that prepares a budget. This is where policy analysis should occur. So the functional review showed that less than 4% of the tasks performed by the Ministry of Finance had anything to do with any kind of analysis, such as nobody examined the efficiency of public spending. The entire effort was spent on operational issues. And in this regard, years of donor technical assistance on which billions of dollars have been spent saw armies of consultants coming to give advice to government and telling them that they should have good policies, or writing a report about what these policies should be, and the heap of short-term trainings and seminars. But the effort to build institutions that can deliver systematic professional education were negligible. But you know, you simply can't learn through a half-day PowerPoint presentation microeconomics for policy analysis or methods of policy analysis. Neither can you farm out the country's policy reflection. Policy cannot be a patchwork of inputs, some coming from IMF, others coming from the World Bank, others from USAID, and the fifth from EU. The result is kash of holovi, porridge in the head. Bold new thinking is required, tapping new ideas, and I think amongst the most promising being new structural economics, whose starting point is endogenous factor analysis, that is, understanding the internal strengths and a coherent program to build on them. On that note, the most optimistic development in Ukraine is the emergence of a very vibrant civil society. Civil society is, after all, the foundation stone, the underlying fabric of society, of a people, and epitomized by the prevalence of networks of voluntary associations, of voluntary associational life in all of its manifestations. Empirical evidence shows that sustainable economic and social development is strongly correlated with the strength of civil society, the willingness of citizens to cooperate and achieve common purposes. The experience of the revolution of dignity resulted in a large number of Ukrainians, especially youth, embracing a new identity that was based on civic engagement, volunteerism, and incredible creativity. When the state failed, civil society stepped in. 1 in 4 Ukrainians, and this is a sample that included a large swath of the population, so if you take away, you know, people who were disabled and in hospitals and people underage, this is a staggering number. 1 in 4 Ukrainians volunteered, were served as volunteers in 2014, 2015. It became called the Volunteer Nation. And to change everyone's stereotype, the capital of the volunteer nation was Dnipropetrovsk. Over 80% of the population think that volunteerism is the cornerstone of civil society. The institution that Ukrainians trust the most, and that's across the country, is volunteers. This bodes extremely well. There are many challenges ahead, but the foundation of citizens acting together through strengthened civil society is a reason for genuine optimism. Ukraine has weak government institutions, but strong civil society. Reforms in education are critical to the former, are critical for the future of economic growth. And the economic growth has a lot of potential, as I tried to show with IT and agriculture, and has a huge potential for development with SMEs. And faced with global disorder, Ukraine is moving in the right direction. European choice is a civilizational option, not just an economic one, and it is an inspiration to the rest of the post-Soviet world and internationally. It is a stark alternative to the authoritarianism and narrow nationalism of Putin's Russia. Hopefully, European institutions will be reformed, making that institutional choice easier to realize. The Ukrainian people have found a clear light at the end of the title. Sorry, have found a clear light at the end of the tunnel, a much better organizing idea for society, and this is a mammoth achievement. The light at the end of the tunnel is hard to perceive in many countries, and especially in the countries where I work. And sadly, as an Afghan friend of mine pointed out, we don't even know where the tunnel is. I don't know how many of you saw the November 2016 Economist cover, "Liberty Moves North, Canada's Example to the World." I think I probably set some sort of record since I showed it to about 100 people in Bishkek. Canada is a fundamentally decent society, and in listing positive attributes, the first point mentioned was its multicultural policy. And I want to say how grateful I am for the opportunity to return to Canada on its 150th birthday and be among Ukrainian Canadians who made a singular contribution in pushing for multiculturalism and making this country a decent place, a place of sanity in this time of overbearing denigration of the other. As we say in Kyrgyz, rahmat.